For most of human history, it took between 15 and 25 adults to raise a single child to functional adulthood. That is not a metaphor. That is the biological specification our nervous systems were built around over 200,000 years of evolution. Then, in roughly 50 years, we compressed that entire system down to two people, a mortgage and a private address. And we told those two people that if they loved each other enough, it would all work out. It did not work out. This is the autopsy. Anthropologists call our species cooperative breeders, which means we are biologically wired to raise children inside a web of multiple committed caregivers. A mother's nervous system was never designed to be the only nervous system regulating a child's fear, hunger, and grief. When that load lands on one or two people, something eventually breaks, and we have been calling that breakage a personal failure for decades. It is not a personal failure. It is a load-bearing wall that was never meant to hold the whole building alone. Human infants are born so helpless that two adults cannot biologically cover the load alone. Unlike every other primate where mothers do nearly all the work, human children require what biologists call cooperative breeding, a web of 15-25 caregivers sharing the metabolic cost. Grandmothers weren't visiting helpers, they were structural necessities. When you strip out those load-bearing supports, the primary caregiver's nervous system doesn't adapt. It breaks. Cortisol stays elevated, patience runs out before noon, and emotional attunement erodes under unshared labor. The parent who snaps at dinner isn't failing at love. They're a biological system, redlining under a load. It was never designed to carry. The village didn't just help with childcare, it made sustainable parenting neurologically possible. Somewhere along the way, the word parent stopped describing what someone does and started describing what someone is. The biological act of having a child takes hours, maybe days, depending on how you count it. But the practice of parenting, the actual verb of it, stretches across decades of daily, unglamorous, often invisible work. Those two things got quietly collapsed into one, and that collapse has consequences. When identity fuses with a title rather than a practice, any criticism of the practice feels like an attack on the person. A parent who hears "you weren't emotionally available" doesn't process feedback. They process a threat to their core self. The badge gets defended the way any identity gets defended, with denial, with counterattack, with silence. And the child on the other side stops trying to reach a parent and starts trying to breach a fortress. That's not a family conflict. That's two people speaking entirely different languages about what love is supposed to do. When a child questions why their parent was emotionally absent, two nervous systems register the same signal: mortal threat. The parent hears an attack on their survival identity. The child feels the rejection that once meant death by exposure. Both brains fire the same neural pathways that respond to broken bones. Not metaphorically, but literally. For 200,000 years, being cast out meant dying within days. So when family roles get questioned, rational conversation becomes neurologically impossible. The cortisol spikes, chests tighten, and ancient terror overrides thinking. The tragedy isn't that families can't communicate. It's that the village these threat detection systems evolved inside no longer exists to contain and regulate the fear. Inside a family system, identity and survival become wired together in ways that feel completely indistinguishable from each other. The story the family tells about itself isn't just a story. It's the load-bearing wall of everyone's psychological safety. When one person begins to question that story, they aren't just causing discomfort for the people around them. They are pulling at something the nervous system has coded as existential, not social. The group doesn't experience the questioner as someone seeking truth or healing or honest connection. They experience them as a threat to the structure that keeps everyone emotionally alive. This is why the response is rarely curiosity. It's panic, it's silence, it's exile. The person asking hard questions gets treated like someone who lit a fire inside a crowded room. And the cruelest part is that neither side is wrong about what they're feeling. One person is suffocating inside the story, and the other is terrified of losing the walls. In a village, a screaming household was everybody's business, not just the family's problem to solve. Neighbors heard the tone of a parent's voice and adjusted their own behavior around that child. Elders noticed when a kid stopped laughing and someone always said something out loud. That ambient social pressure wasn't intrusive, it was corrective. It was the feedback loop that kept high-stress environments from calcifying into permanent ones. But the private home sealed all of that off behind a single locked door. What happens inside stays inside, and the neighborhood learns not to ask. Psychologists call a version of this the bystander effect. The more diffuse the responsibility, the less likely anyone intervenes. When no one owns the problem owns the family. So, a child can spend 18 years inside a cortisol-soaked environment, and the street outside never once registers a signal. The damage accumulates in silence, invisible to everyone except the person absorbing it. Children don't become who they are because of what you tell them once or twice. They become what gets consistently rewarded, day after day, year after year. When a child learns that calm gets ignored, but performance gets applause, they file that lesson deep. When tears are met with discomfort and achievement is met with warmth, the child doesn't think, they adapt. They build a self around whatever the environment reliably rewards. That self isn't fake exactly, but it isn't whole either. It's a survival strategy wearing the costume of a personality. And here's what makes this so quietly devastating. Praise for the mask feels identical to love. The child can't tell the difference, and honestly, neither can the parent. So the mask gets stronger, the real self gets quieter, and by adulthood, the distance between who they are and who they learn to be can feel completely unbridgeable. A parent who was never soothed cannot teach their child how to be soothed. It's not a choice they're making. It's a gap that lives inside the nervous system itself. The body learns regulation the way it learns language, by being immersed in it, early and repeatedly. When that immersion never happened, the wiring simply isn't there to pass on. And here is where most conversations about parenting go wrong because they treat this as a moral question. They ask whether the parent tried hard enough, loved deeply enough, wanted it badly enough. But a nervous system doesn't respond to wanting. It responds to what it was built from. So, the damage moves forward, not because love failed, but because the architecture that carries love was never fully constructed. The inheritance chain isn't cruelty passing down through generations. It's an absence, quiet and invisible, dressed up to look exactly like presence. Consider two dogs raised in the same house, by the same hands, eating the same food every day. One thrives and one suffers, not because of love, but because of biology. Human children are no different from each other in this fundamental, often invisible way. The same dinner table that feels safe to one. Child feels like a courtroom to another child sitting right beside them. One nervous system reads a raised voice as information, and another reads it as mortal threat. These aren't failures of character or parenting. They're the predictable outputs of wildly different neurological architectures running inside the same operating system. We bred dogs into hundreds of shapes and then accepted that a greyhound needs different things than a retriever does. We have never extended that same basic logic to our own children, inside our own homes. A child whose brain is wired for novelty will starve inside a structure built for compliance and routine. And that starvation doesn't look like sadness. It looks like defiance, distance, and eventually, disappearance. In the 1960s, a researcher named John Calhoun built a perfect world for mice and watched them collapse. He gave them unlimited food, unlimited space, zero predators, and total safety. And the mice didn't thrive. They stopped grooming each other, stopped raising their young, stopped connecting entirely. Calhoun called it behavioral sink, the point where a population withdraws from social life because the environment itself has become too distorted to navigate. What we call estrangement looks, at the species level, almost exactly like that. It isn't a dramatic personal rupture between two people who stopped loving each other. It's an organism reading its surroundings and concluding that engagement costs more than it returns. When the village disappears and two exhausted people are left holding every role it once distributed, the nervous system doesn't blame the individuals. It just starts pulling back. Estrangement isn't a failure of love. It's a withdrawal symptom from a habitat that no longer supports the species that needs it. The nuclear family wasn't an accident. It was engineered. Rome discovered that isolated family units create better soldiers. Fathers with something exclusive to protect will fight enemies whether the threat is real or manufactured. What started as military strategy became economic, policy, then cultural norm, then biological trap. The suburban house with its private address doesn't just separate families from community. It separates them from the load sharing that made child rearing sustainable. Jobs demand mobility, so love scatters across time zones. Children grow up watching. Parents disappear into exhaustion without explanation, then leave for colleges that teach them home is something you escape, not return to. The architecture wasn't neutral. It was designed to serve systems that needed isolated, anxious units more than they needed thriving villages. Forgiveness has almost nothing to do with the other person, and that's the part nobody tells you. Your nervous system doesn't care whether the person who hurt you deserves your peace. It only knows whether you're still carrying the threat signal inside your body. When you hold a grievance, your amygdala treats it like an open wound, still bleeding, still dangerous. The body keeps the score, and it keeps the bill too, charging you in cortisol and shallow breath and broken sleep. Releasing that signal isn't absolution, it's integration. It's your nervous system finally filing the event under past instead of present. The other person doesn't have to change, apologize, or even know it happened. You're not rewriting history or excusing the architecture that failed you. You're simply telling your biology that the threat is no longer live. That distinction is the whole thing. There's a version of parenting that nobody puts on the box, but it changes everything when you find it. It doesn't ask you to be the architect of another person's life or the author of their story. It asks you to walk beside someone who arrived here just as confused and unfinished as you once were. Think of your child not as your creation, but as a younger traveler on the same bewildering road you're still walking. That reframe is not a softening of responsibility, it's actually a deepening of it. A steward doesn't own the land, they tend it, protect it, and eventually hand it forward. When a parent holds that frame, control stops being the goal, and presence becomes the whole point. The question shifts from, what did I build, to what did I protect and honor? That single shift in orientation can quietly dissolve the architecture of estrangement before it ever fully forms. What died wasn't a lifestyle or a quaint arrangement of thatched roofs and shared cooking fires. What died was the biological scaffolding that made human love sustainable. For hundreds of thousands of years, no single pair of adults was ever meant to carry the full weight of raising children alone. The village didn't just help with childcare, it absorbed the overflow of human need that two people simply cannot hold. When it collapsed, every generation after inherited a silent structural debt they had no language to name. Parents began failing not because they loved less, but because they were attempting something biologically impossible without knowing it. Children began leaving not because they were ungrateful, but because the pressure inside those walls had nowhere else to go. The estrangement epidemic isn't a moral failure spreading through families. It's a structural wound spreading through time. And the only honest response to a wound that real is grief that's just as real. Understanding the mechanism doesn't hand you a repaired relationship, and it was never supposed to. What it hands you is something quieter, and in some ways more durable than resolution. It lets you stop asking what's wrong with you, and start asking what was wrong with the structure. That shift is not small. When you stop diagnosing yourself as the failure, you can finally see the actual patient on the table. You can grieve the village you deserved without needing someone to confess they took it from you. You can hold your estrangement as evidence of a broken system, not a broken soul. That doesn't dissolve the pain, and it doesn't rewrite what happened between you and the people you loved. But it does mean you're reading the wreckage accurately. An accurate reading is where every honest rebuilding has to begin. The social archaeologist doesn't fix the collapsed city, but she does tell you exactly what fell and why it fell.